When we imagine a medieval feast, we picture an atmosphere of warmth and absolute abundance. Roaring fires, bards playing lutes, overflowing goblets of spiced wine, and tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and exotic birds. It seems like the ultimate display of luxury and comfort. Yet, if you were actually seated at a banquet in the 10th century, your senses would be overwhelmed, and not in a good way. Beneath the display of wealth, a medieval feast was an endurance test of cold food, rancid smells, crippling social anxiety, and stomach-churning hygiene. The first disappointment would hit you the moment your food arrived. Castles were highly flammable, so kitchens were almost always built in separate buildings, or far away from the Great Hall. This meant that every dish had to be carried across open, drafty courtyards and up winding stone corridors. In the dead of winter, the icy wind stripped the heat away instantly. By the time a servant placed a magnificent slab of roasted venison in front of you, it was lukewarm at best. Worse, the animal fats would have already cooled, forming a thick, waxy white paste over the meat. You weren't eating a steaming, tender roast. You were chewing on cold grease. And you wouldn't be eating that cold meat off a fine ceramic plate. In this era, plates were a rarity. Instead, diners were given a trencher, a thick slice of heavy, 4-day-old, rock-hard bread. As the feast dragged on for hours, you piled greasy meats and sauces directly onto this bread. Gradually, it soaked up the juices, turning into a soggy, disintegrating mess on the table. You didn't have a fork either. You ate with your bare hands and a personal knife, tearing meat off the bone with fingers slick with grease. And when you were thirsty, you drank from a communal cup shared with the person sitting next to you. You drank their backwash, their grease smudges, and whatever illnesses they happened to be carrying. But the taste of the food was nothing compared to the smell of the room. The stone floor of the great hall was covered in rushes, dried reeds meant to insulate the room. While fresh rushes smelled sweet, the layers underneath trapped weeks of spilled ale, spit, grease, and animal waste. Lords loved their hunting dogs, and dozens of them roamed beneath the tables, fighting over dropped bones and relieving themselves where they stood. Look up, and the air was just as bad. Without modern ventilation, thick wood smoke from the central hearth became trapped beneath the rafters, mixing with the sharp tang of cheap, sour wine and the body odor of hundreds of unwashed people wrapped in heavy wool. Your eyes watered, your throat burned, and your clothes smelled like stale smoke for weeks. You also couldn't just sit back and relax. A feast was a minefield of social anxiety. Where you sat dictated exactly what you ate. The Lord and his honored guests sat at the high table on a raised dais, above the salt. They ate the imported spices, the roasted swans, and the freshest bread. But if you were a lesser knight or a lower-ranking member of the household, you sat at the far end of the hall. You had to sit and watch the rich gorge themselves, while you were served cheap, tough cuts of meat, or simple oat pottage. You were practically eating leftovers. One breach of etiquette, like wiping your greasy hands on the tablecloth instead of your clothes, could permanently ruin your social standing. As the night wore on, the physical toll of the feast set in. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. The nobility loved using heavy, expensive spices like cloves and pepper, partly to show off their wealth, but also to mask the slightly sour flavor of meat that was past its prime. Gorging on heavily salted, highly spiced, and partially rotting meats, washed down with gallons of thick, unfiltered ale, wreaked havoc on the digestive system. Imagine the reality of dozens of desperate guests trying to relieve themselves in the dark. Castles only had a few garderobes, small latrines that dropped straight into the moat or a pit below. The lines were long, the smells were unbearable, and the privacy was non-existent. A medieval feast was never truly about enjoying a hot, relaxing meal. It was a theatrical performance of power. The Lord showed off his wealth, and the guests endured the drafts, the smells, and the cold food to prove their loyalty. The next time you see a movie with kings tearing into steaming turkey legs while laughing warmly with their friends, remember the reality. Remember the congealed fat, the soggy bread plates, the smoke-filled air, and the dogs fighting at their feet. The feast may have been grand, but it was a long way from comfortable.